Good morning, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to today's webinar, which I think is extremely important, extremely timely, and I think you will benefit a lot from it, probably because we have the most prominent and trusted source of business policy in the country, in my estimation, being our leader today, which is Neil Bradley. Let me give you a little introduction to Neil. Neil is the Executive Vice President and Chief Policy Officer and Head of Strategic Advocacy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. In addition to managing policy development, Neil oversees the government affairs activities, political program, and relations with other business organizations. Neil has led the national discussion and hundreds of high-profile policy issues influencing legislation at federal, state, and local levels. He frequently appears on broadcast and cable news networks to present the business community's priorities, and I'm sure that's going to be much more prominent after yesterday. Prior to joining the U.S. Chamber, Neil spent 20 years working in the House of Representatives. He served as the Deputy Chief of Staff for then Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy. He held similar positions for Eric Cantor of Virginia and House Republican Whip Roy Blunt of Missouri. He's a graduate of Georgetown University and resides in Chevy Chase, Maryland, and he is a native of Sapulpa, Oklahoma. Sounds like a big, thriving metropolis, Neil. But let me give you a personal perspective of Neil also. Since COVID, Neil has meant an enormous amount to us as a chamber and chambers all around the country. He has given us timely updates, very detailed updates of everything going on nationally and internationally. He has taken leadership positions on many, many impactful business policies that have helped businesses. He supported the chambers around the country, including us. He was the keynote speaker at our 2023 Business Summit. And I would say he is a very great ally of ours and a very trusted advisor. And with that, I will open it up for Neil to give a few opening remarks. After that, I will have a little dialogue with Neil, and then we will open it up to questions. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. So, Neil, thank you very much for being here. It's all yours.
Well, Tom, thank you. And let me just say, I could return all the wonderful compliments about you and the team at the New Jersey Chamber. I've just learned not only so much about what's going on in New Jersey and the economy there, but the leadership that you've kind of deployed, including that summit that you were kind enough to invite me to about a year and a half ago, about what leadership looks like when you're trying to turn a state around and really focus on growth. And I think that matters so much. By the way, Sapulpa is a thriving metropolis by Oklahoma standards. It probably wouldn't quite meet the definition of a thriving large city by New Jersey standards, but that's the beauty of this great country. Let me just start with what's on everyone's minds, and that's obviously yesterday's announcement on tariffs. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Let me just tell you what I think we saw yesterday. It was more aggressive in terms of tariffs than I anticipated, and if you're looking at the market reaction, I think what most market participants also anticipated. The president described it as reciprocal tariffs, which in some ways you can argue could make sense. If country A puts 10% on our machinery, then we should put 10% on their machinery. That's not exactly what happened yesterday, and we knew that it was going to be a little bit broader than that. The administration had talked about kind of non-tariff barriers, regulations, sanitary standards, kind of other things that make it harder for us to sell abroad. They said things like the value-added tax, which is equivalent to our sales tax, was a barrier to trade, which it's not, and that they were going to have this kind of blended approach of both tariffs, dollar for dollar, and these non-tariff barriers. That's not what the executive order does. What the executive order does is it applies a base 10% tariff on every country around the world, with the only two meaningful exceptions, Canada and Mexico for USMCA compliant goods. Remember, everything else from Canada and Mexico is already at 25%. And then they did a pretty simple math calculation. They took the trade deficit with each individual country and divided it by the level of exports from that country into the United States. That gives you a percentage, and then they cut that percentage in half, and there was your tariff. And so it introduced some weird aspects. Places like Singapore, who don't impose any tariffs on us, get hit with 10%. Places like Australia, where we have a trade surplus, got hit with 10% last night. Israel, that 3 days ago said that they would cut their tariffs to zero, got hit with 17% because Israel has more of a trade deficit with the United States. There are a few carve-outs. Lumber, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, copper. But the thing that all of those carve-outs have in common is that the administration has announced that they are pursuing product-specific tariffs on all of those individual things. And so to give you a kind of a kind of real-world practical example of kind of what we're talking about here, I used this example in an earlier breakfast this morning. I'm a big coffee drinker. We don't grow much coffee in the United States. We import about $8.5 billion worth of coffee from around the world every year. If you look at the countries by countries, and even if you assume Mexico and Canada can bring coffee in duty-free, which is a big assumption, the duties announced last night, the taxes announced last night on every other country is a $1.3 billion tax on coffee, which equates to about 15% of the price before it ever reaches any of us in a store or a restaurant. And so the set that you can do a similar analysis kind of across kind of all these other things. That's just a way of saying these are a pretty big tax hikes. Last thing I'll say on tariffs, and I just want to mention a couple other things and get to questions. We do have other tariffs coming into effect. Last night at midnight, 25% tariffs on autos went into effect, and we initiated the process for a 25% tariff on auto parts. That's what spurred a lot of the run at dealerships this past weekend. In talking with automakers and suppliers, this is going to be likely to lead to supply chain disruptions like we saw in COVID. And one of the reasons is anyone who's on the line who's in the import business knows this better than I. But if you're importing into the United States and you're bringing something in with more than a $2,500 value, you have to have a bond so that the U.S. government knows that you're going to comply with all the laws and importantly pay the tariff. Since most things come in low tariff or duty free, a typical mid-sized manufacturer might have a $50,000 bond, and they might buy that from a customs broker for a pretty nominal fee. That same import, depending on what they're importing, we talked to one yesterday, they have to post a $20 million bond effective beginning, well, at some point today when their $50,000 expires. If they can get the bond, you can imagine what the price is that they're paying relative to that. And so it's not a question of the ability to get and move goods. It becomes a cash flow issue. And so if you don't have the cash and you normally get paid for the part, 30 to 60 days after you bring it in, and all of a sudden you have to have the cash to post a bond, and you don't have that cash, you actually can't afford to import the thing that you need to import so that you can generate revenue. And so we do anticipate that those are the type of disruptions that we're going to begin seeing. Let me move off that because that's obviously not a very optimistic outlook on what's going on in the economy. There are more optimistic things going on, particularly on the tax front. At the end of this year, we have a massive $4.5 trillion automatic tax increase. Overshadowed by the tariff news last night was the news that the Senate had come to an agreement on a budget resolution to unlock, with a simple 51 vote majority, a process to not just extend most of those tax cuts, but make them permanent, which would obviously be very good news for businesses. And I know Tom and I will get into some of the specifics of those tax provisions in a minute, but that's good news. On the regulatory front, we've removed a lot of kind of the regulatory overhang from the prior administration, though I will say that's been discounted somewhat by some of the kind of confusion and chaos and some of the federal agencies who we still need to be kind of there and operational to help guide business, provide certifications for various things, kind of answer questions. So we have a lot of positive things on the horizon on tax. We can get through this moment and get to more regulatory certainty, and on energy, with the exception of wind, certainly a more of an all of the above approach that should over time help bring down prices. So despite yesterday's news, I want to prevent some level of optimism on some fronts, because it's not always good or bad news, as you all know. It's usually a mix, and that's a little bit of where the mix stands today. And Tom, I'm happy to stop there and take questions and dive into some of these issues more deeply.
Neil, thank you. And as usual, a very comprehensive and straightforward overview of what we're dealing with today. Let me start out by saying I think everybody understands, I think, what the president's goal is to make America more self-sufficient, to be more economically viable, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of the things he's doing right now are going to be short-term negatives that we are going to have to suffer through, I think, maybe including a recession. And what do you think the time frame is before some of the things he's doing turns around and become positives to get us back on a positive track?
Tom, I think what we're going to have to do is narrow some of these policies on the tariff side, particularly, and kind of refocus on some of the positive kind of pro-growth. At the moment, I think we're a little bit out of balance in our balance of kind of pro-growth and things that are harmful to growth. We're a little bit too much on the harmful side at the moment. You're right. The president wants to build more stuff in America, and I think part of that is figuring out, okay, well, what is it that we really want to build, and what do we want to make investments to try to build? Like, to go back to my coffee example, I don't care what you do, we're never going to meet domestic demand with domestic production of coffee. So a tariff on that is just a tax increase that raises prices. There are, as we saw the last couple of years, semiconductors where there is an opportunity to make investments. I think shipbuilding, where we've kind of fallen behind and we've allowed China to take the lead. There's some kind of opportunities there, but we're going to have to narrow these policies, particularly on the tariff front, down. That's particularly important because there are some natural headwinds at the moment to being able to dramatically ramp up domestic production. Some of them the administration can fix, particularly with respect to permitting at the federal level. But of course, we need states and localities to improve their permitting, for example. Part of it is increasing particularly electric supply and connectivity. By the way, we probably need more copper, aluminum, and steel to be able to do that. So getting that mix of policy right to expand electric production. But some of it's pretty hard. It's a workforce issue. And so because of the demographic nature of our country, 10,000 baby boomers hitting retirement every year, we're now at the kind of the peak of the baby boom retirement. We continue to have more open jobs than we have people looking for work, and we just don't have enough bodies. And we're going to have to, even as we deal with the border and people who came illegally into the country, we're going to have to dramatically ramp up people's ability to come legally if we're going to have the workforce to be able to produce these things. Last thing I'd say, and this is a bright spot, this is perhaps the biggest bright spot I see. And what I wake up excited about every day is artificial intelligence. AI has the ability to really make us much more efficient and to help us make more things and make them more efficiently. Under the prior administration, we had a kind of regulate first approach that saw more harm in AI than promise. By the way, I can prove that the prior administration's executive order on AI mentioned negative consequences, fear, 91 times, and mentioned opportunity 30 times. That's why it spawned close to 100 different regulatory initiatives. This administration's approach is much more on the front of seizing the opportunity of AI, and that may be the thing that that really helps us turn this around as we get out of whatever valley we're going into.
Let me just pick up on the AI comment, Neil. I don't know if you know, but the state of New Jersey, in conjunction, in partnership with Princeton University, Microsoft, and CoreWeave, have put together an AI institute in New Jersey that they hope to be a national and maybe international leader in AI research and development. It was just the ribbon cutting was last week. It's a great move forward with four very strong entities. But the issue is energy. AI requires energy, which we don't have. We don't have enough energy from what I hear from our utilities to handle increased consumer demand, let alone the demand that AI is going to require. So how do you address that energy issue?
Well, the part that the administration has right is a more all of the above, including even modular nuclear reactors. I would add wind back into that mix. I think we should kind of be agnostic to wherever we can get the energy from, although I understand that that's a point of contention with various views on it. But perhaps the most important thing, in addition to expanding production capacity of electricity, is we have to be able to move it around to where we need it. And that's a huge problem right now. So the grid is already overloaded. If you talk the utility producers I talk to, even as they expand capacity, their problem is being able to get it onto the grid and get the people who need it connected into the grid. That means a pretty big build out of our electric grid system. Part of that's held up by NIMBYism and some of the regulatory process. Part of it is now held up by some of the cost increases on the input side. I'm talking to a utility, and they're willing to go. They're trying to figure out what the cost structure is because, of course, they have to pass on the cost, recoup it from ratepayers, and they don't know what it's going to be given steel, aluminum, and importantly, kind of copper tariffs. And so that's why I'm saying we got to kind of mix all of these things and get the mix right to be able to take advantage. But kudos on that AI thing. That may be the single most important thing any state kind of jurisdiction can kind of do to be ready to seize the future.
Yeah, it's a huge initiative, and I think it's, with the people involved, it should be very prominent and hopefully achieve its goal, which would be great, great for the country and great for New Jersey. So let me ask you about manufacturing. One of the things the president has said is he hopes that his tariffs will bring more manufacturing back to the U.S. And make us more self-sufficient with a lot of these products. Do you think that will happen?
I think not in the scale that the president imagines. I think first, I think it's important when people look at manufacturing, what do we want to measure? Do we want to measure manufacturing output, or do we want to measure manufacturing jobs? And often when people say that they are looking at jobs, and of course the share of Americans employed in manufacturing is down quite dramatically. The interesting thing is that manufacturing production is actually up. So we are producing more with less people, and it kind of looks like agriculture in that way. We used to have a lot more people to produce the same bushel of corn compared to where we are today. I do think there's some possibility to continue expanding manufacturing production by getting the efficiency gains, lowering energy costs, and improving permitting. Um, uh, but if the goal is employment, that's probably going to mean a lot higher prices for the things that we are that we are manufacturing. And so I think we have to kind of balance those things out. And I think we have to decide we're not ever going to make everything in the United States. So what are the things that from a national security standpoint that we feel we have to have some level of domestic production on? And we ought to devote our energies to kind of those things. And so the last thing I'd say about that is even when we do make things here, we often get a lot of inputs from other places. And so about half of our trade in goods with other countries is not goods coming in that go directly onto a shelf for the consumer. They are inputs for US manufacturers. And that's a kind of the nature of the supply chain today. And so you're talking about a Herculean effort to take about $1.5 trillion of manufacturing inputs and somehow begin to source them domestically. I think that is a real challenge. And by the way, going back to the workforce thing, that probably means pulling people off of services. And, we've become a service economy, financial services, intellectual property, many of the things that New Jersey leads in, because those generate higher value and people earn more money being in providing those service fields than they did kind of the manufacturing. And I think we have to think long and hard whether we want to pull people off of higher value, higher wage jobs to substitute in for a widget that from a national security standpoint might not matter that much.
I think the challenge for our state, New Jersey, is that if these manufacturing opportunities are going to be available, we have to make our state much more economically attractive and a desired place to do business, because I think jobs, the plants and the jobs and so forth are going to go to the most desirable areas, and we've got some work to do. So
No
I
question
think
about
that's a challenge for us. Let me shift over to the Tax Act, the 2017 renewal of the tax cuts, which what I've heard from many companies is those tax benefits really helped many companies survive over the last few years when we've had such economic uncertainty in the US. And the fact that they're coming back are going to be a huge plus. And as you said, the permanency of those tax cuts will be huge for business. But the thing that you and I have talked about several times that's very important to the state of New Jersey is what the SALT level is. I've heard all kinds of estimations from going to 20 to 40, but do you have any idea if that's what the level of SALT will be increased to?
I don't. I can tell you it's going to be a lot higher than it is today. I don't know where the negotiations are kind of going to fall out. I tend to think it's not an elimination of salt, of the salt cap, but a very kind of significant increase in it. And it would not all surprise me that it's at the high end of the 20 to 40 that you just outlined, which is kind of what we're hearing. The
We
one thing
heard last, go ahead.
Go ahead, Tom.
I said we heard last week from one of the leading gubernatorial candidates that that person thought it was going to be about $40,000.
Yeah, that if you made me pick a number today, that's where I would land. Now, that's not to say that won't change as negotiations kind of unfold, et cetera. I will flag, because I do think this is important, and we're spending a lot of time pushing back on this. There is proposals floating around amongst Republicans on Capitol Hill for what they call B salt or sea salt, which is to make state and local taxes, including property taxes and income taxes, non-deductible for businesses. Um,
Yeah.
that would be devastating. And I think we'll avoid the imposition of something like that. But you're talking about a significant hit, not just for big businesses and kind of corporations, but if you apply it to property taxes, for example, um, um, a pretty significant hit. And so we're spending a lot of time educating people on the Hill about why that's a bad idea.
And I had read that before, and it's kind of the Robin Hood approach, right? Taking from the rich and giving to the poor. But it overall, it would have I think, a greater negative impact than positive impact because the businesses which would be benefited by the tax cuts will now have to come back and get that deduction eliminated, which kind of negates the benefit of the tax cuts that are being proposed. So
Yeah, it would be a net tax
self-defeating.
increase for almost every business. It would be a
Do you
net
think
tax increase.
do you think there's a possibility that that will happen?
I don't. I think we're going to be successful, and but it was kind of one of these ideas that you can appreciate how this started. Someone said, "Well, we should, we should try to lure all those companies from those high tax states." They particularly reference New York and California, but I'm sure sometimes throw in New Jersey, and we'll move them to low tax states. And we had to remind them that businesses pay taxes in every state, and you're not going to, without huge disruption to the economy, you're not just going to pick up and move. Like you got to have a piece of land that you're operating on. You can't pick that up and move it. And
Yeah.
so it's not like someone who goes to Florida and spends 6 months in a day.
Let me shift gears to DOGE. Um, I think everybody understands the intent of DOGE. The way it's been carried out, I think, has been more problematic than the intent. Do you think that DOGE can be positively impactful in Washington if done with a better method?
I do. And I think we're beginning to kind of make that turn. One of the things that came out of a discussion between Senate Republicans and the president yesterday at the White House was the idea that all of the cuts that DOGE has been kind of pulling together would be packaged up for Congress's consideration. And Congress would essentially approve the ones that they want to keep and kind of reject the ones that they don't. I think that will be. I don't know where that ends up on kind of individual proposals. It kind of depends on horse trading and the votes, et cetera. But I think perhaps the most important thing is it provides a breathing space for people to take a look and say, did we really mean to cut that program or to shut that office? The second aspect is particularly as agency heads are settling in, we're now having conversations about, hey, DOGE came in, you wanted to cut the workforce, you did that. I don't know that anyone realized that that office is a real example from 2 days ago in Pittsburgh that you closed is the only office that certifies respirators for industrial production. And people have to have their respirators certified for compliance. So we kind of need those people back because we kind of need those certifications. Unless you want to get rid of the certification, which by the way, no one wants to do because we also don't want to turn this over to the trial bar here. And so I think we're going to have some success in turning.
So, is the rumor of Elon Musk leaving true?
I think so, but who can say for certain?
Yeah. And I keep reading about he had a 130-day window to do this, and that day is coming up. And
Yes, that
obviously
is
his
true. As
business
a
is
special
having trouble.
government employee, that's correct.
Yeah. Yeah. So that would have to be, I guess, renewed for him to stay on.
There are complications to that, but the rumors are that it might be well short of the 130 days.
Yeah. So with regard to some of the DOGE cuts that are being made, obviously, the potential loss of federal funding for states like New Jersey could be significant. And we're going through our budget process right now, and our budget process, absent any reduction of federal funding is in trouble. We're having difficulty balancing our budget without increasing some taxes, which we don't need by any stretch of the imagination. And any kind of federal funding cut is going to probably reopen the budget after those cuts are announced and cause even more distress in the state of New Jersey. So that's a big, big negative to this. And I heard, if I heard what you said, Congress has to deal with that and might eliminate the potential of that.
I think Congress, listen, I think two things are true. One is at the end of the day, Congress is going to have to decide whether these cuts stick or not. And so there's something called impoundment. This is a constitutional question about whether the president can just refuse to spend money. I think our legal team, many others believe that the president can't just simply refuse to spend money. For certain grants that aren't dictated by law where the money goes, he can decide who gets the money. But if the law says New Jersey's entitled to X, you are entitled to X until Congress changes that law. And so I think there's going to be some uncertainty around that for things that states are entitled to. But at the end of the day, that's going to be affirmed unless Congress does something. Now, I do think that as part of the reconciliation bill, I think Congress is going to take a look and probably pull back some level of existing spending. Now, whether that's in the nutrition programs and food stamps, Medicaid, which obviously has a huge impact on state budgets. I think that remains to be seen. I don't think it's $1.5 trillion like members of the House are talking about. I think it's a much smaller number than that at the end of the day, but I don't think that the number is zero. And so I do think that beginning to sort out the things that are disrupted for now from a state budget standpoint, federal money flowing to New Jersey, but that are likely to remain, and the things that where there is potential real reductions coming from Congress is the important way I would kind of begin thinking about this and engaging kind of the delegation.
For many months or year, maybe more than maybe a year or so, the U.S. Chamber has been promoting the 3% economic growth mandate. Do you still think that that's achievable with what we are now dealing with the president's new mandates?
3% is absolutely achievable, but one of the reasons that we started pushing the 3% is it used to be the case that 3% wasn't that difficult to hit because of the tailwinds that we had in the economy. From kind of post 1950s, women entering the workforce, baby boomers, kind of at the prime working age, where we were economically vis-a-vis the rest of the world, we kind of had the wind in our sails. And today, that's less the case. We can grow a little bit of female participation in the workforce, but we've seen to kind of come up against some limits there. Baby boomers, there's just nothing we can do, right? This is just demographic destiny here. And so the reason we started pushing this, we said to get to 3% growth, you got to get a lot of policies right. You got to get tax policy right, regulatory policy right. You need a functioning legal immigration system. We need to be expanding trade, not restricting it, kind of all of these things. And so to answer your question specifically, I believe 3% growth is possible. I believe you absolutely have to have the right policy mix. And today we have some of the policies that are right, and we have some of the policies wrong, and we got to fix that because the policies that we have right are not enough to offset the policies that we have wrong to get to 3%.
When you get your policy priorities in order here that will dictate how we can achieve a 3% growth, love to have those because we'd like to try to implement as many of those in New Jersey as we could because we would desperately love to have a 3% growth in our economy or greater. So we'll appreciate that when you get it.
Of course, of course.
Um, you've talked for many years about the need for the U.S. to increase its number of trade partners. And we have not been able to do that, or was not a priority, I guess, for the Biden administration. And I'm not sure about the first Trump administration. But with today's current action of the president, will we have the ability to increase trade partners?
I hope so. And I want that to be the silver lining that comes out of this, because I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but the the growth in U.S. exports to countries, both in goods and services, and we sell a lot of services. People tend to think of tangible things, but we sell a lot of services around the world: financial services, insurance services, intellectual services, and R&D. Those are really good. I mean, those are really high value exports. Entertainment, very high value export. When we ink a trade deal with a country, we dramatically grow our level of exports, which obviously helps grow the economy. If you put on an optimistic lens of yesterday, it's well, great, this can start negotiations. And I hope that it does. You're right. You have to go back to the end of the Bush administration and beginning of the Obama administration to the last time that we inked a trade deal with a new partner. And that's a long time. And the rest of the world has done about 100+ trade deals since then. So the rest of the world is moving forward without us. If I'm being honest, the fear that I have is that, as I mentioned at the beginning, earlier this week, Israel said, great, we'll go to 0% on tariffs. And the hope is that they wouldn't get impacted by the tariffs announced yesterday. Instead, they got hit with 17%, not on the basis of their tariffs and reciprocity, but just a numerical calculation based on the trade deficit. I don't know what the negotiation then looks like to get that back to 0%, because if they have to eliminate all their tariffs and they still get hit with a 10% tariff, which, by the way, is multiples of what they were a week ago, I'm not sure exactly how that works out. And so I'm hopeful, but I'm having trouble seeing the path.
I just saw in the chat from one of our attendees a comment on DEI, and DEI has caused many organizations to change their policies, whether they wanted to or not. And in fact, I would just tell you that yesterday, Princeton University was defunded on many research projects because of their DEI policies. So can you just give us your take on the impact of the president's DEI mandate?
Yeah, so let me preface this by saying this is not legal advice. Everyone should go get the appropriate legal advice. Our lawyers would appreciate me saying that. So the way I look at this is I begin with the president didn't change the law. He can't change the law. And so discrimination practices that were illegal before he took office are illegal today. If it was legal before he took office, it's legal today. No one has kind of changed kind of the law. It is the case that in some of the executive orders, what he's tried to lay out is the administration may have a more restrictive view of what the law permits than was previously understood. At the end of the day, though, if he wants to pursue that, and he did sign an executive order that directed DOJ to go after up to at least 9 companies in each industry sector for bad DEI practices with a civil complaint. If he wants to do that, he's going to have to prove that kind of in court at the end of the day. I think the thing that, Tom, that you just mentioned that I think is real and that is happening is this idea of leveraging federal funds or access to the federal government um, to the policies that an institution or a company adopts. And there, again, if you look at the law firms, those who've had these challenges, who've challenged it in court, have been successful in getting immediate injunctions. The courts have said you really can't do that. But every institution's kind of deciding separately the extent to which that they want to fight this out in court versus come to some agreement. Um, I think our view at the chamber is, of course, people have to make the decisions that are best for them and their institutions. But we should operate in a system in which the rule of law really governs here. And institutions and businesses have the freedom to, within the law, make the decisions that they think is best for them. And if it turns out they make a bad decision, it'll be hard to attract students or hard to attract employees or hard to attract customers. And if they make a good decision, it'll be easier to do that. And that the markets are the better way of resolving that. So from a business standpoint, kind of philosophical, I think we have a lot of concern. I'm not here to second guess what any institution or company does in responding to these issues with the administration. But I would say that the law still hasn't changed.
And in New Jersey, companies are making some very tough decisions on this, and some are going against the grain of what they're all about, but they're doing it because they think they have to. So I guess it's a wait and see situation. So we have a few minutes left. So Amira, can we open it up to the questions that have been asked of Neil? Amira, you're on mute. Amira, you're on mute.
There you go. Sorry, I wasn't able to unmute myself. So we did cover the DE&I question. We have another question here. Do and if so, how do the tariffs or any of the latest orders affect the service industry? So like offshore IT services, engineering services, and other intellectual property product sectors. And I know you touched on that briefly, Neil, but could you elaborate?
Yeah, on the tariff front, what we saw yesterday really is about goods and not about services. However, services could be principally impacted by the retaliatory responses of our trading partners. And you've already seen kind of indications in Europe, in particular around IT and data services, that they're looking for that to be part of their response. In Canada, where the anger with the United States is much bigger than just tariffs at the moment, and is really beginning to affect not just B2C business, but we've heard from companies even in the digital and financial space that's beginning to affect B2B business. It becomes collateral damage. And so I think to the extent that you're looking at going through the executive orders and saying what impacts those IT, engineering, kind of service sectors, you're not going to find much that's specifically. Where we're seeing it is in the reciprocal ramifications, where countries and even businesses are saying, hey, if we're in a trade war, we're gonna do business with someone that we're not in a trade war with. And they don't have to make that choice, but we've seen evidence of people beginning to make those choices.
Thank you. One more question came in. So, in reference to what you said about our labor shortage and us needing to increase legal immigration, um, now we are seeing a lot of people out of work in New Jersey, and not being counted in the unemployment numbers. How can we sort of address the issue of the current citizens that aren't able to secure employment?
Yeah. So first, I think Peter asked that. I agree completely. We ought to be expanding, particularly for prime age working males, 25 to 54-year-old males, are still under. They are not participating at sufficient levels in the workforce. It's also true that we ought to do more to get veterans, the formerly incarcerated, individuals with disabilities in the workforce. And this ought to be an all of the above strategy. From a numeric standpoint, though, even if we were successful in kind of maximizing workforce participation skills of those groups, we're just still short. And so, the way I look at this is kind of the overall kind of bell curve of what's your overall population and what's the maximum number of people within that you can kind of legitimately have working. And you're not going to have a whole bunch of kids under 18 working. And even if we expand the retirement age, at about 70, it kind of begins to fall off. The interesting thing that we're in right now demographically, and just use my parents as an example, a couple of years ago, they retired. They're in great health. They continue to consume. They go out and eat. They shop. They spoil their grandkids. Like they do all the stuff that they want to do kind of in their retirement. There are just a lot of those people today, and they're going to be with us, thank goodness, for quite a long time. But they're not going to become producers. And so at the moment, our demographic makeup is we just have a lot more people in the age bracket that they are consumer non-producers. And we just don't have enough people in the producer consumer bracket. And that's at the end of the day, it's just a demographic makeup. And so I want to do everything that you suggested and more, but I want to be realistic about it's not even a bell curve, but the wave of where we are demographically.
Sure, thank you. And another question came in. How are you seeing the oppositional impact of consumer boycotts? I know we're seeing a lot of that against companies that roll back popular programs and initiatives in reaction to the demands of the administration.
We are seeing some of that. I think this is why, to Tom's point, these are very, very hard decisions for companies, and you're balancing the economic threats that exist, potentially because of the demands of the administration, with your consumers and your employees. And I wish I don't have the right answer for you about exactly how the right way to balance that is. I think that's the right question to ask. And I think that's the question that every business kind of has to figure out how best to navigate. And my hope is that with a little bit of time, we can move past kind of these demands from the administration that create this dilemma for companies. And maybe the courts will do that. I think in some instances, the courts will.
Amir, is that all the questions?
That is all the questions in the chat.
Tom, I wanted to mention something to Neil if I could. Neil, really appreciate you and your legal team of what you've done, especially in the last administration, on the challenges, whether it was with the Federal Trade Commission or the credit card late fees rule or the joint employer rule. You guys just did outstanding legal work. We have a couple of bills in our New Jersey legislature that's challenging some of our member companies. One in particular, I know that you legally challenged similar issues in California and Vermont, holding petroleum companies liable for climate change. We have a chairman in the Senate Environment Committee. He's doing EPR legislation where we're trying to mirror what some other states have done. We talked about AI. He wants the AI companies to buy green energy. We don't even have that available. Just kind of want to get your thoughts on those new challenges, if you will.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of them. Let's chat offline about how we can help on these producer responsibility fees, which is just really retroactive taxes on companies that were selling energy legally to consumers. And I
Right.
mean, you know, forget my example about the price of coffee. Think about what that's going to do to the price of everything, because we still need energy, and we can help on those fronts. Um, we'd love to help if we can on the legal challenges, if we think there is one, on some of these energy production kind of requirements. And so we do think the last couple of years were kind of record years for us in our litigation against some of the federal agency overreach. I suspect the next couple of years, we're still going to have some of that. There's still some overreach, as we've talked about today, but we're probably going to have record levels of litigation against states for some of this overreach. Blue and red, I should just clarify.
Right.
It's not just blue states that are doing this. And we'd be happy to work with you guys to figure out, can we challenge some of this stuff in court?
That's great. Thank you.
So we want to honor, I know you're very busy, Neil. We want to honor the 10 o'clock cutoff time. One last comment or question, I guess, to get your advice on. Everything we talked about today builds to probably the single biggest issue facing business today, which is enormous uncertainty. Uncertainty is the biggest enemy of business, and everything that we've talked about raises different levels of uncertainty, and the cumulative impact of that is devastating. What would you give as some advice to the business community in dealing with massive uncertainty?
I think so. A couple of things. One is it's kind of opposite as this sounds. I think C-suites have to expect that their teams will not be able to give them perfect clarity about the direction of where these policies are going. And so we've been dealing with a lot of C-suites, et cetera. Like, someone must know, you just have to tell us. And how can we be certain? And the truth is you can't. So you have to figure out a range of outcomes. And by the way, none of this is good. Like, this is still bad, but you have to figure out a range of outcomes that you can begin planning on. And you have to focus on the ones that are most impactful to the up or the downside for the business. And so that means separating kind of some of the rhetoric from the practical reality of the range of outcomes. And so one of the things that we're doing at the Chamber, and we're happy to partner with Tom and with any of you all to help kind of do this, is to help create an understanding of the range of outcomes. Just like we talked about on federal spending today, there are some things that are being talked about that are out of the bounds of the range of outcomes. And so you shouldn't have to worry about those. There are things that we're in with the range of outcomes, and you can kind of plan for that. Unfortunately, at the moment, on the tariffs, the issue that we began with, the range of outcomes at the moment, given how tariff authority works in our country today, is unbounded by the law. And so the bounds are going to be the economic reaction and kind of the political reaction. So that's not a great answer to your question, but it's the best I can offer in terms of, taking very precious time that every leader has to figure out how to process this.
I'm not sure there is an answer to the question, and that's why I posed it to the one person I thought could give an answer. But I understand the magnitude of the question. But Neil, it's 10 o'clock. I want to thank you for extremely insightful comments, very helpful to the people on the call today. I also want to thank you for all you have done for the business community, and being a very trusted supporter and advisor of ours for many years. And I look forward to continue that relationship. And the one thing I would really compliment you and your colleague Sarah Armstrong on is You're always very accessible, very responsive, and very honest and transparent in your comments. So appreciate all that. Thank you for being on today, and I'm sure we will talk soon.
Perfect. You picked a great time to have this, by the way, because
I
right in
know.
the middle of it all. It's perfect.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Tom.
Neil.
Bye bye.
Thank you.